Maya Chen had delivered food to hundreds of addresses in the 3 years she'd worked at Eddie's Corner Diner, but she'd never stepped foot inside the Ashford Tower before today. The building rose 68 floors into the Seattle skyline, all steel and glass, and the kind of money that made her monthly rent look like pocket change. She clutched the catering box against her chest as she crossed the marble lobby, her sneakers squeaking against floors so polished she could see her reflection, feeling like an imposter in a world that operated on rules she'd never been taught. The security guard barely glanced at her ID before waving her toward the executive elevators, and Maya wondered if this was how it felt to be invisible to people who mattered, to be so far beneath their notice that you became part of the furniture. Her manager, Eddie, had been weirdly insistent that she take this delivery personally, even though Danny usually handled the corporate orders, and she'd caught him watching her with this strange expression when he handed her the address, like he knew something she didn't. The elevator climbed smoothly, the numbers ticking upward with mechanical precision, and Maya checked the receipt again even though she'd memorized it already. Penthouse level, personal delivery to Mr. Robert Ashford himself, the founder and CEO of Ashford Industries, one of the wealthiest men in the Pacific Northwest. She'd seen his face on billboards and in the business section of newspapers. Eddie kept behind the counter, always wearing that same controlled smile that never quite reached his eyes, always surrounded by expensive suits and expensive watches, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to check a price tag. The elevator chimed and the doors slid open onto a reception area that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought normal offices were too warm and human, all sharp angles and minimalist furniture, and windows that overlook the city like a predator surveying territory. A receptionist with perfect hair and a tablet glanced up, her expression shifting from polite professional to barely concealed confusion when she registered Maya's diner uniform and the grease-stained box in her hands. "Delivery for Mr. Ashford," Maya said, trying to sound like she belonged here, like she delivered lunch to billionaires every day. The receptionist's manicured finger tapped against her tablet screen with the kind of precision that suggested she found the entire situation distasteful. "Mr. Ashford is expecting you through those doors. Second office on the left." Maya nodded and walked past her, pushing through heavy oak doors that probably cost more than her car, into a hallway lined with abstract art that she suspected was supposed to mean something profound but just looked like expensive confusion to her eyes. The second door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see the edge of a massive desk and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Seattle skyline like a painting. She knocked, heard a voice call out to enter, and stepped into an office that redefined everything she thought she knew about workplace spaces. The room was bigger than her entire apartment, furnished with the kind of casual wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Leather chairs and dark wood, and bookshelves filled with first editions that probably had their own insurance policy. But it was the walls that caught her attention, covered in photographs and framed articles documenting decades of business success. Robert Ashford shaking hands with presidents and celebrities, cutting ribbons at building openings, accepting awards from organizations with long formal names. And there, between a photo of Ashford with the governor and a framed magazine cover, hung a portrait that made Maya's heart stop in her chest and the delivery box nearly slip from her suddenly nerveless fingers. The portrait showed a man in his early 30s wearing a military dress uniform, ribbons and medals arranged precisely across his chest, his face captured in that particular expression of controlled pride that service members wore for official photographs. But it was his eyes that stopped Maya cold, the same unusual hazel green that she saw every time she looked in a mirror, the same slightly crooked smile that appeared in her face when she laughed at something genuinely funny, the same widow's peak hairline that she'd inherited and always considered just another genetic quirk without deeper meaning. She knew that face because she'd grown up with a single photograph of it sitting on her mother's bedside table, the edges worn from decades of handling, the colors faded but the image burned into her memory with the permanence of childhood trauma. "You can set it on the desk." Robert Ashford's voice cut through her paralysis, sharp and commanding in a way that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. Maya forced her eyes away from the portrait and looked at the man behind the desk, seeing him clearly for the first time. This legendary figure who'd built an empire from nothing, whose success story got taught in business schools as an example of American determination and strategic genius. He was in his 70s now, his hair silver but still thick, his face lined with decades of high-stakes decisions, wearing a suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. He was reading something on his computer screen, fingers moving across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who'd never had to doubt his right to take up space in any room he entered. Maya walked forward on legs that felt disconnected from her body, setting the delivery box on the corner of his desk with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to control them. She should leave now, should take her tip if he offered one, and walk out of this office and never think about what she'd seen, but her eyes kept drifting back to that portrait on the wall, to the face that haunted every conversation she'd never had with her mother about where she came from and why her father had disappeared. "Is there a problem?" Ashford asked, still not looking up from his screen, his tone carrying that particular edge of impatience that powerful people used when dealing with service workers who'd overstayed their usefulness. Maya's mouth opened and the words came out before her brain could stop them, her voice sounding strange and distant in her own ears. "Who is that?" She pointed at the portrait, her hand shaking visibly now, her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough that she thought he might hear it. Ashford's fingers stopped moving on the keyboard and he looked up at her for the first time, really looked at her, his eyes doing a quick assessment that catalogued and dismissed her in approximately 3 seconds. "That's Lieutenant James Morrison. He saved my life in Iraq back in..." His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone discussing ancient history, important but resolved, filed away in the mental archives where painful memories went to lose their sharp edges. "Why do you ask?" Maya felt the floor tilt under her feet and gripped the edge of his desk to steady herself, her knuckles going white with the pressure. "That's my father," she said, and watched Robert Ashford's face go absolutely pale, all the blood draining away like someone had pulled a plug somewhere vital, his carefully maintained composure cracking right down the middle to reveal something raw and terrified underneath. Maya started writing the letter to her father 3 weeks into her first full-time semester at the University of Washington, sitting in her dorm room at midnight when the campus had finally gone quiet and she could think without the constant noise of other people's lives pressing in around her. She'd never written to him before, had always thought it was pointless to put words on paper for someone who'd been dead longer than she'd been alive, but her therapist at the Veterans Center, a former Marine who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan, had suggested it might help process everything that had happened since that delivery to Ashford Tower had detonated her understanding of her own history. "Dear Dad," she wrote, and the words looked strange on the page, addressing someone who'd existed only as a concept and a photograph for her entire life, someone who was becoming real through other people's memories and testimonies, but would never be real enough to actually know. "I'm 22 years old now, the same age you were when you met Mom, and I'm trying to figure out if that means something significant or if it's just a numerical coincidence that doesn't carry the weight I want it to carry. I found out 3 months ago that you knew about me before you died, that your last words included instructions for raising me to be someone who chooses principles over convenience, and I've been trying to decide if that makes your absence easier or harder to bear." She paused, chewing on the pen cap, trying to articulate feelings that didn't have clean edges or simple categories, that existed in the complicated space between gratitude for finally knowing the truth and anger that the truth had been kept from her for so long. "Here's what I know about you now that I didn't know before. You saved Robert Ashford's life and he spent 22 years trying to earn redemption for costing you yours. You were brave in ways that most people only pretend to understand, the kind of brave that gets you killed protecting people who make stupid decisions for selfish reasons. You loved Mom enough that she was still your last thought while you were bleeding out in a desert, and you loved me before you ever met me, before you even knew if I'd be a son or daughter, just loved the concept of me enough to think about what kind of person you wanted me to become." Maya felt tears dripping onto the paper and wiped them away, leaving smudged ink that somehow felt appropriate for a letter that was really just a one-sided conversation with a ghost. "I'm studying social work because it turns out I'm pretty good at making powerful people uncomfortable by demanding they face consequences for their actions, and I figure I might as well build a career on that particular skill set. Mom is finally retired and actually sleeping more than 4 hours a night, which feels like a miracle I'd stopped believing was possible. We have a community center named after you that helps people who fell through the same cracks we spent 2 decades navigating without support. She wrote for another hour, filling pages with updates and questions and the accumulated weight of 22 years of one-sided conversations she'd had in her head. And when she finally finished and folded the letter into an envelope, she felt something shift in her chest. Not closure exactly, because closure suggested an ending, and this felt more like a beginning, like finally being introduced to someone she'd always known but had never actually met. The one-year anniversary ceremony for the Morrison Family Veterans Center drew a bigger crowd than Maya had expected, filling the courtyard with veterans and military families, local politicians who'd shown up for the photo opportunities, and journalists covering the story of the billionaire who'd spent 2 decades atoning for a lie. Maya stood at the podium wearing business casual clothes that still felt like a costume compared to her diner uniform, looking out at faces she recognized from the center's daily operations, people whose lives had been changed by services that existed because her father had died protecting a convoy that should never have been authorized. "My father has been dead for 23 years, Maya began, her voice amplified through speakers that carried her words across the assembled crowd. "I never met him. Never heard his voice except in video footage. My mother managed to dig up from his basic training graduation, never got to ask him questions about life or relationships or what it felt like to know you were doing the right thing even when the right thing was going to kill you. For most of my life he existed as a concept rather than a person, a hero in the abstract whose sacrifice I was supposed to honor without really understanding what that sacrifice cost him or my mother or me." She paused, seeing her mother in the front row with tears streaming down her face but smiling anyway, that particular expression of pride mixed with grief that Sarah had perfected over 2 decades of showing up to school events and graduation ceremonies without a husband beside her. "Last year I found out that my father's last words were instructions for raising me to be someone who chooses principles over convenience, who stands up for what's right even when it's hard, who values other people's welfare over personal safety or profit. And I also found out that those words were kept from my mother and me for 22 years by someone who couldn't face the consequences of his own actions, who let guilt drive him to build an empire while we struggled to pay rent in a 1-bedroom apartment." She saw Ashford standing at the back of the crowd, half hidden behind other attendees, wearing a suit that probably cost more than the average person made in a month, but looking smaller somehow than he had in his office, diminished by public acknowledgement of his failures in a way that private confession had never achieved. "This center exists because Robert Ashford finally told the truth, because he spent 22 years trying to become worthy of the sacrifice my father made protecting him and his contractors, because guilt can be a powerful motivator when it's finally acknowledged and acted upon rather than buried under success and philanthropy that never addresses the root cause. I don't forgive him, and neither does my mother, but we recognize that his money and resources have created something meaningful here, something that helps people who need support navigating systems that were designed without their struggles in mind." Maya gripped the edges of the podium, gathering herself for the closing she'd rehearsed a dozen times but still wasn't sure she could deliver without breaking down completely. "My father died believing that protecting other people was worth his life, that coming home to me and my mother was less important than making sure other soldiers got home to their families. That's a choice I'll never fully understand because I'm selfish enough to wish he'd chosen differently, selfish enough to want him here even if it meant other people's fathers died instead. But I'm trying to honor what he valued, to build a life that reflects the principles he died for, to be the person he wanted me to become even though he never got to see if I succeeded. This center, these services, the families we help, that's not atonement for anyone's guilt and it's not adequate compensation for what was lost, but it's something real and tangible that changes lives every day, and that feels like the best possible memorial for a man who spent his last minutes making sure other people survived." The crowd applauded and Maya stepped down from the podium, accepting hugs from strangers and thanks from people whose lives had been changed by services funded through her father's death and Ashford's guilt, and she felt the weight of 22 years of questions finally settling into something that resembled understanding if not quite peace. The silence that followed her words stretched out like broken glass, sharp and dangerous and impossible to navigate without getting cut. Ashford stood up from his chair slowly, the movement careful and deliberate, like a man who'd just realized he was standing on unstable ground and any sudden motion might send him plummeting. his hands pressed flat against the surface of his desk, fingers splayed wide, knuckles prominent under papery skin that suddenly looked every one of his 73 years. "That's not possible," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction, each word coming out measured and hollow, the statement of a man trying to convince himself of something he already knew was a lie. "James Morrison died in Baghdad in 2003. I was there. I saw him die." Maya felt something cold and sharp twist in her chest, a sensation like being stabbed with icicles. Because that was the story she'd always been told too, the official narrative that her mother had repeated until she'd stopped asking questions altogether. "My mother's name is Sarah Chen," Maya said, hearing her voice shake but pushing forward anyway, because she'd come too far to back down now, because standing in this office with this man's obvious terror radiating across the space between them felt like stepping through a door she'd been searching for her entire life. "She worked as a translator at Fort Lewis before I was born. She met my father there in 2002. They dated for 8 months before he deployed to Iraq. She found out she was pregnant 2 weeks after he shipped out. She never heard from him again." Ashford's eyes closed for a long moment, his face contorting with something that looked like physical pain, muscles tightening around his jaw, and temples in a way that made him suddenly appear older and more fragile than his billionaire status suggested any human could be. When he opened his eyes again, they carried a weight that Maya recognized from her own mirror, the specific exhaustion that came from carrying secrets too heavy for one person to hold. "How old are you?" he asked, and the question came out rough, like gravel being dragged across concrete. 22, Maya answered. "I was born in March 2003. My mother has his picture, his dog tags, and exactly 17 letters he sent her from basic training and the month before he deployed. She also has a letter from the Department of Defense informing her that Lieutenant James Morrison was killed in action on February 14, 2003, during a convoy ambush outside Baghdad." She watched something flicker across Ashford's face at the mention of that date, a flinch so subtle she might have imagined it except for the way his hands pressed harder against the desk, like he needed the physical support to stay upright. "Valentine's Day," he said softly, almost to himself. Of course it was Valentine's Day. The words carried implications that Maya couldn't parse, layers of meaning buried in a history she'd never been part of, and watching this powerful man crumble under the weight of whatever knowledge he carried felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion, each crack revealing structural weaknesses that had been hidden under a facade of strength for decades. "You need to leave," Ashford said suddenly, his voice sharp again, snapping back to that commanding tone with visible effort, trying to resurrect the armor of authority that had kept him safe in boardrooms and in negotiations for 50 years. "This is not a conversation we can have. I'll have my assistant send you compensation for your time, but you need to go now." Maya felt anger flare hot in her chest, burning away the shock and confusion that had kept her off balance since she walked into this office. "No," Maya said, and the single word came out harder than she'd intended, sharp enough that Ashford actually flinched, his carefully constructed authority cracking wider to reveal the frightened man underneath. "You don't get to dismiss me like I'm an inconvenient delivery driver who's overstayed her welcome. That's my father on your wall. You just told me you watched him die, which means you knew him, which means you have answers that my mother has been searching for since before I was born, and I'm not leaving this office until you tell me what the hell actually happened." Ashford's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession, anger and fear, and something that might have been respect, and Maya realized with sudden clarity that people probably didn't talk to him like this, that his wealth and power had insulated him from direct confrontation for so long, that he'd forgotten how to respond to someone who refused to be intimidated by corner offices and expensive suits. "You don't understand what you're asking," Ashford said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge, replaced by something that sounded almost pleading. "Some stories are better left buried. Your father died a hero. That should be enough." Maya felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall, refused to give this man the satisfaction of seeing her break down when she'd spent 22 years being strong because her mother needed her to be strong, because growing up without a father in a world that asked intrusive questions about family structures had taught her to armor herself against casual cruelty. "That's not your decision to make," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning in her chest. "You don't get to decide what I know about my own father. You don't get to decide what closure my mother deserves. You knew him. You have his picture on your wall like some kind of shrine. You owe us the truth." Something shifted in Ashford's expression, a wall crumbling that had been built with decades of careful maintenance, and he sank back into his leather chair with the heaviness of a man accepting defeat. "Lock the door," he said quietly, gesturing toward the office entrance, "and clear your schedule for the next few hours. This story doesn't have a version short enough to tell standing up." Maya walked to the door on shaking legs, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and turned the lock with a click that sounded final and irrevocable, like closing a door on one version of her life and opening another that she couldn't yet see the shape of. When she turned back, Ashford had pulled out a bottle of whiskey from a desk drawer and was pouring himself 2 fingers with hands that trembled almost as badly as hers had when she'd set down the delivery box that felt like it belonged to a different lifetime now. "Your father was the best man I ever knew," Ashford said, staring into his glass like it might contain answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. "Which is why I spent the last 22 years making sure nobody ever found out what really happened to him, including the daughter he never got to meet and the woman he loved enough to die for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Maya's brain struggled to process, because heroes who died in combat didn't require cover-ups and decades of silence, and the sick feeling growing in her stomach told her that whatever truth was about to emerge would be the kind that redefined everything she thought she understood about her father and herself and the billionaire who'd just admitted to maintaining an elaborate lie for longer than she'd been alive. Ashford took a long drink before speaking, the whiskey seeming to give him courage or maybe just numb the edges of whatever memory he was about to excavate from the burial ground where he'd kept it hidden for 2 decades. "I was a different person back then," he started, his voice taking on the distant quality of someone narrating events that happened to a stranger. 32 years old, fresh MBA from Harvard, father's money burning a hole in my trust fund, and absolutely convinced I was destined for greatness if I could just find the right angle, the right opportunity to prove myself. My father made his fortune in defense contracts during Vietnam, and I thought I could multiply it by investing in private security firms in Iraq, getting in on the ground floor of the Reconstruction boom. Everyone was promising would make millionaires out of anyone smart enough to show up with capital and connections. Maya listened without interrupting, watching this titan of industry transform into someone younger and more desperate with each sentence, shedding decades of accumulated authority to reveal the ambitious fool underneath. "I formed Ashford Security Solutions in late 2002, he continued, his fingers tightening around a whiskey glass. "Hired a bunch of former military guys who were willing to work contract positions for better pay than the army offered. Convinced myself I was providing a valuable service while really I was just another rich kid playing with lives I didn't understand for stakes I couldn't comprehend. Your father was assigned as military liaison for one of our contracts, overseeing security operations for supply convoys running between Baghdad and Al-Assad Air Base. I met him in January 2003, and I hated him almost immediately." The admission startled a laugh out of Maya before she could stop it, the sound harsh and unexpected in the heavy atmosphere of the office. "You hated him?" she asked, because that seemed inconsistent with having his portrait on the wall, with the careful reverence Ashford had used when saying his name earlier. "I hated him because he was everything I pretended to be," Ashford said, and the honesty in his voice cut deeper than any corporate doublespeak could have. "He was genuinely brave, genuinely competent, genuinely cared about the soldiers under his command in a way that went beyond career advancement or ego. He questioned every decision I made, pushed back on operations he considered too risky, filed incident reports when my contractors cut corners on safety protocol. He made it very clear that he thought I was an irresponsible dilettante playing soldier with other people's lives, and the worst part was that he was absolutely right." Maya felt a strange pride bloom in her chest despite everything, despite the dread building with each word about where this story was obviously heading, because the father she'd never known was taking shape as someone honorable and principled and exactly the kind of man her mother had described in the rare moments she'd been willing to talk about him. "February 14, 2003, Ashford said, the date coming out like a confession, Valentine's Day. I had a convoy contract worth $3 million, supplies and construction materials needed at Al-Assad by the 16th, or we'd lose the contract and face penalties that would have bankrupted my entire operation. Your father told me the intelligence reports showed increased insurgent activity along the primary route, recommended we delay 48 hours until the situation stabilized. I overruled him, told him we were going, told him if he wasn't willing to authorize the military escort, then I'd run the convoy with just my contractors, and explained to his commanding officer why a lieutenant was interfering with legitimate business operations. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the weight of decisions made by young men with too much confidence and not enough wisdom, and Maya felt her throat constrict with understanding what was coming next, what her father had died trying to prevent. He went anyway, Ashford said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, like speaking too loudly might summon ghosts he'd spent decades trying to outrun. Your father could have filed a report, could have gone over my head to his CO, could have let me drive my contractors into whatever ambush was waiting. Instead, he authorized the escort, pulled together 6 Humvees worth of soldiers, and led the convoy himself from the front vehicle. I rode in the command truck in the middle of the column, surrounded by my contractors and supplies, safe behind the military protection I'd bullied him into providing. Maya's hands clenched in her lap hard enough that her nails bit into her palms, physical pain to anchor her against the emotional storm building in her chest, because she could see where this was going with horrible clarity, could picture her father making the choice to protect people who didn't deserve his protection, because that was what honor demanded and principles required. We made it about 40 kilometers outside Baghdad when the shooting started. Ashford continued, his eyes focused somewhere past the windows, seeing a desert road instead of Seattle's skyline. Insurgents had set up a perfect kill zone, RPGs from elevated positions, small arms fire from buildings on both sides of the road, a disabled truck blocking the forward route. Your father's vehicle took the first rocket, driver killed instantly, 2 soldiers injured badly. The convoy was stuck, couldn't move forward or back, taking fire from multiple positions, while my contractors panicked and my supplies burned and people died protecting my profit margins. His voice broke on the last words, and he finished his whiskey in one harsh swallow, pouring another with shaking hands. Your father got out of the damaged Humvee, organized a defensive perimeter, called in air support that was 15 minutes out, which might as well have been 15 hours given the situation we were in. I watched him move between vehicles, directing fire, pulling wounded soldiers to cover, completely exposed to incoming rounds like he'd made peace with dying, and decided to spend his last minutes making sure as many people as possible lived. I had never seen anything like it. I had never seen that kind of courage that wasn't performing for cameras or chasing medals, just pure human decency under circumstances that turned most people into animals. Maya felt tears streaming down her face now, and didn't bother to wipe them away, her chest aching with grief for the man she'd never known, but was meeting through Ashford's guilt-laden testimony. The air support arrived and drove off the insurgents, but by then we'd lost 3 soldiers and 2 contractors, had 7 more wounded critically. Your father was hit in the initial ambush, shrapnel from the RPG that destroyed his vehicle, but he'd stuffed gauze under his vest and kept moving because people needed leadership more than they needed him to acknowledge that he was bleeding out. By the time the shooting stopped and the medics got to him, he'd lost too much blood. We stabilized him enough for medical evac, got him on a helicopter to the combat surgical hospital in Baghdad. Ashford's face contorted with memory, and something that looked like physical illness. He was conscious during the flight, kept asking about his soldiers, wanted confirmation that everyone who could be saved had been saved. The medic told him everyone was accounted for. And then your father looked at me and he said something I've heard every single day for the last 22 years in my head, over and over like a recording I can't shut off. He said, "Tell Sarah I love her, and I'm sorry I won't be there to meet our baby." Ashford spoke the words like they were being physically dragged out of him, each syllable weighted with decades of guilt. "Tell her I kept the promise I made to always choose the right thing, even when it was hard, and I need her to teach our kid to be better than me, to be someone who doesn't just talk about principles but actually lives them. Tell her I died making sure good people got home to their families, and that's enough. That's all I needed my life to mean." Maya's breath caught in her throat and a sob burst out before she could contain it, raw and painful, and carrying every question she'd swallowed growing up. Every Father's Day she'd pretended not to notice, every school event where other kids had dads, and she had an empty chair and a mother who smiled too hard while dying inside. "He knew about you," Maya managed to say through tears, The words coming out broke. He knew about me and he was thinking about me while he was dying, and my mother never knew that. She spent 22 years thinking maybe he didn't even know she was pregnant, that he died without knowing I existed. Ashford's face crumpled completely then, the billionaire facade shattering into pieces, revealing the man who'd been carrying this specific brand of torture since before Maya was born. He died in surgery 2 hours later, Ashford said. Organ failure from blood loss, complications from the wounds, clean death, relatively speaking, considering what can happen in combat. The chaplain asked me if I wanted to pass along his last words to his family. I said yes. I took down your mother's information, wrote down exactly what he'd told me to say, promised the chaplain I'd make the call as soon as we got back to base. His hands were shaking violently now, whiskey sloshing in the glass, and Maya realized what was coming before he said it, the truth emerging like poison that had been festering for decades. I never made that call, Ashford said, and the confession came out like physical pain. I went back to my hooch and I sat there with the paper in my hands, your mother's phone number right there, 10 digits between me and keeping a promise to a dying man, and I couldn't do it, because if I called her, if I told her what James said, I'd have to explain how he died protecting my convoy that I'd insisted on running against his professional judgment. I'd have to explain that her husband, your father, was dead because of my ego and my greed and my absolute refusal to listen to someone who actually knew what they were talking about. I'd have to hear her grief and know I was responsible for causing it, and I was too much of a coward to face that. Maya felt rage burn through her grief, hot and purifying, and directed at the man across the desk with laser focus. So you just said nothing? She asked, her voice low and dangerous. You let my mother think he died randomly in some nameless ambush, let her spend 2 decades wondering if he even knew about me, deprived her of his last words because you were too chicken shit to face consequences for your own action. Ashford nodded, tears running down his face now, the mighty billionaire crying like a child in his expensive office, while admitting to a betrayal so profound, Maya couldn't find adequate words for the scope of it. I told myself I'd honor his memory in other ways, Ashford continued, the words tumbling out like he'd been waiting 22 years to confess and couldn't stop now that he'd started. I shut down Ashford Security Solutions immediately, lost millions walking away from contracts, burned every bridge I'd built in the defense industry. I took the remainder of my trust fund and invested it in legitimate businesses, built an empire on the foundation of trying to be the kind of man James Morrison would have respected, made ethical decisions that cost me profits, but let me sleep at night, donated millions to veteran causes and military family support programs. I hung his portrait in every office I've ever had as a reminder of what real courage looks like, and what my cowardice cost. He turned from the window to face Maya directly, his expression raw with self-loathing. I've spent 22 years trying to earn redemption for a sin I never confessed, trying to become worthy of the sacrifice he made, and the whole time I knew that nothing I built could ever erase what I'd stolen from you and your mother. His last words, his final thoughts, his acknowledgement that you existed, and he loved you. I took all of that and buried it because facing you meant facing what I'd done. Maya stared at him across the gulf of his massive desk, this man who'd built a billion-dollar empire on the foundation of her father's death and her mother's unanswered questions, and felt something shift in her chest, the rage transmuting into something colder and more calculated. You can't fix this, she said flatly. There's no amount of money or charitable giving or ethical business practices that will ever make this right. You stole my father's dying words from us. You let my mother grieve without knowing that he was thinking of her at the end, that he knew about me, that he loved us enough that we were his last thoughts while he was bleeding out in a desert on the other side of the world. That's not something you get to atone for. Ashford nodded, accepting the judgment, looking almost relieved to finally hear someone say out loud what he'd been telling himself privately for decades. You're right, he said simply. I can't fix it, but I can finally tell the truth, deliver the message I should have delivered 22 years ago, and face whatever consequences come from that. I can set up a trust in your name, establish a foundation honoring your father's memory, make sure you and your mother never have to worry about money again. It won't be atonement because atonement isn't possible for what I've done, but it's better than continuing to let you work minimum wage, delivering food to buildings where your father's legacy helped build my fortune. Maya wanted to tell him to keep his money, Layla to reject his guilt-driven compensation on principle, but she thought about her mother working double shifts at the hospital for 30 years, about the apartment with windows that didn't quite close and heat that didn't quite work in winter, about all the times they'd chosen between groceries and utilities, and pragmatism won over pride. I want it in writing, she said, her voice hard. Every word of what you just told me notarized and witnessed and legally documented. I want a full accounting of what happened to my father, signed by you, admitting your responsibility. I want his last words written down exactly as you remember them. And then I want you to sit down with my mother and tell her everything you told me, face to face, and accept whatever reaction she has, without trying to defend yourself or minimize what you did. Ashford nodded slowly, something like hope flickering in his expression at being given concrete actions to take, a path toward partial redemption even if full forgiveness was permanently out of reach. Sarah Chen's living room felt impossibly small with Robert Ashford sitting in it, his expensive suit and expensive watch and expensive presents seeming to draw all the oxygen out of the space, making everything shabby by comparison, even though Maya's mother kept their apartment spotlessly clean, despite working 12-hour shifts at Harborview Medical Center. Sarah had been home for maybe 20 minutes when Maya had called and asked if they could come over, if she could bring someone who had information about James, and her mother's voice had gone tight and small over the phone in a way Maya recognized from childhood, the particular sound of hope, fighting against decades of learned disappointment. Now Sarah sat on the couch wearing her nurse scrubs, her face still showing the exhaustion of a night shift, hands folded in her lap, with the kind of rigid control that suggested she was holding herself together through pure force of will. She'd gone completely still when Maya introduced Ashford, recognition flickering across her features, because even after 22 years away from the military world, she remembered the names from James's deployment, remembered Ashford's security solutions, and the man whose decisions had shaped the final months of her husband's life. Mrs. Chen. Ashford started, his voice rougher than it had been in his office, stripped of corporate polish by the raw intimacy of sitting in a home where James Morrison's presence still lingered in the single-framed photograph on the mantel, in the folded flag from his military funeral displayed in a shadow box on the wall. I don't have adequate words to apologize for what I'm about to tell you, but I owe you the truth that I should have given you on February 16, 2003, 2 days after your husband died in Baghdad. Sarah's hands clenched together, knuckles going white, but she nodded for him to continue, and Maya sat down next to her mother on the couch, taking one of those rigid hands in her own, feeling her mother's pulse hammering against her wrist. Ashford told the story again, every detail he'd confessed in his office, his voice cracking in places, but pushing through because stopping would have been another kind of cowardice. He described the ambush, James's leadership under fire, the helicopter ride where he'd been conscious and lucid enough to think about home and family and the daughter he'd never meet. He described taking down the message, promising to deliver it, and then sitting in his quarters and making the choice to stay silent, rather than face the pain his decisions had caused. When he got to James's actual last words, repeating them exactly as he'd memorized, Sarah made a sound that wasn't quite a sob, but wasn't quite a scream either, something caught between grief and relief and fury, and she pressed her free hand against her mouth like she could physically contain the emotion trying to escape. He knew, Sarah said when she could speak again, her voice breaking around the words. All these years I thought he died not knowing about Maya, that his last thoughts were of me but not of us, that he went into the ground without knowing he was going to be a father. Every year on her birthday I wondered if he would have been proud, if he would have loved her, and you kept that from me. You stole 22 years of knowing that James's last words were about our baby, and I hate you for that. I will hate you for that until the day I die. The words came out sharp as knives, Sarah's grief transforming into righteous anger, and she stood up abruptly, pulling away from Maya's hand, pacing the small living room like she needed movement to contain the storm building inside her. Do you have any idea what that would have meant to me? Sarah's voice rose, decades of military spouse composure shattering completely, to know that James's last thoughts were of our baby, that he wanted her raised with his values, that he was proud of the choice he made even as he was dying. I spent 22 years telling Maya stories about her father, trying to build an image of a man she'd never know from 17 letters and one official photograph, wondering if I was getting it right, if I was honoring his memory adequate. And you had the one piece of evidence that would have told me I was doing exactly what he wanted, and you kept it from me because you were too much of a coward to face what you'd done. Ashford took the verbal assault without flinching, sitting perfectly still in the worn armchair, accepting every word like physical blows he deserved, and had been waiting to receive for longer than Maya had been alive. "You're right," he said quietly, when Sarah paused for breath. "There's no defense for what I did. I stole something precious from you and your daughter out of pure selfish cowardice, and I've spent 2 decades building an empire on the foundation of that theft, while telling myself I was honoring James's memory. I came here today to finally deliver the message I should have delivered in 2003, to tell you that your husband loved you enough that you were his dying thoughts, and to offer whatever restitution I can provide, inadequate as it will be." Sarah stopped pacing and looked at him with an expression that mixed contempt with something that might have been pity, seeing him clearly for the first time as the broken man he'd become rather than the powerful billionaire he appeared to be. "Money doesn't fix this," she said, echoing what Maya had told him in his office, "but it can make my daughter's life easier, can honor James's sacrifice in ways that matter to people beyond just us. So whatever you're offering, I'll take it, not because I forgive you, because I don't and I never will, but because James would have wanted Maya taken care of, and refusing your guilt money doesn't serve anyone except my pride." 3 months later, Maya stood in front of a building she still couldn't quite believe existed, a 3-story community center in the Rainier Valley neighborhood where she'd grown up, its exterior freshly painted and windows gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The sign above the entrance read, "Morrison Family Veterans Center," in letters big enough to see from the street, and underneath in smaller text, "In memory of Lettin James Morrison, 1971-2003, who chose courage over safety and others over himself." Ashford had moved faster than she'd thought possible once he'd been given permission to act, liquidating assets and cutting through bureaucratic red tape with the kind of efficiency that only truly wealthy people could manage when they decided something mattered more than profit margins. The center provided free counseling services for veterans and military families, job placement assistance, childcare, educational support, everything that people like Maya and her mother had needed 22 years ago when Sarah had been a pregnant widow, trying to navigate a system that offered sympathy but very little practical help. The trust fund Ashford had established in Maya's name contained enough money that she'd never have to worry about rent or groceries or choosing between textbooks and utilities again, enough that she could quit the diner and enroll full-time at the University of Washington to finish the degree she'd been taking one class at a time for 4 years, while working double shifts to help her mother with bills. Sarah had retired from nursing the week after Ashford's check cleared, 30 years of night shifts and double overtime finally ending, and Maya had watched her mother cry while signing the retirement papers, tears of relief and exhaustion and grief for all the years James hadn't been there to see what they'd built, despite his absence. The grand opening ceremony was scheduled for tomorrow, with local politicians and veteran organizations and media coverage that would put James Morrison's name in newspapers and websites, telling his story not as another casualty statistic, but as a man who'd chosen principle over self-preservation and paid the ultimate price for protecting people who'd never adequately appreciated the sacrifice. But today was just for family, for Maya and Sarah to walk through the building before it filled with strangers, to see James's portrait hanging in the main lobby, to read the plaque that told the full story of what had happened in Iraq, including Ashford's role and responsibility. Because Sarah had insisted that the truth needed to be complete even if it was uncomfortable, that honoring James meant acknowledging the circumstances of his death, rather than sanitizing them into something palatable. Ashford hadn't come today, had sent his regrets through his attorney along with another donation to the center's operating fund, and Maya was grateful for his absence because his presence would have complicated the grief and pride and healing that she and her mother needed space to process without the weight of his guilt pressing down on them. "Your father would be proud of you," Sarah said quietly, standing next to Maya on the center's front steps, her hand finding her daughter's the way it had 1,000 times throughout Maya's childhood when words weren't adequate and touch had to carry the meaning instead. "Not just because of this building or the money or the foundation, but because you demanded the truth when it would have been easier to walk away, because you made someone powerful face consequences they'd been running from for decades, because you're exactly the kind of person he wanted you to be, someone who stands up for what's right even when it's hard. Maya squeezed her mother's hand and felt tears threatening but didn't let them fall, because this wasn't a moment for sadness even though grief was woven through every part of it. This was a moment for acknowledging that healing was possible even when justice came 22 years late, that truth mattered even when it arrived damaged and incomplete, that her father's legacy could still shape the world in ways he'd never imagined when he made the choice to protect people who didn't deserve his protection.